Hello, everyone. Today, I want to talk about the difference between the Old and the New Testament tithing. I have talked about the voluntary tithing, compulsory tithing, festival tithing, poor tithing, and burnt grain tithing, which all of these were the practice of the Old Testament law. The question remains, can we pay tithe under the new covenant? My answer is yes. We can tithe under the new covenant. However, the method of our tithing system in the new covenant has been changed from the method of the old covenant tithing system. Now, let's see what changes. In the Old Testament, the Israelites were under Mosaic law. They were expected to meet all the requirements of the law by deeds. They walk according to the commandment of the law, and they were judged under the deeds of the law. In the New Testament, we are under the law of grace, and we were made right with God by faith in Jesus Christ and not by the deeds of the law. When Jesus came, he inaugurated a new covenant law through his death, which brought changes to the old law. Christ, who is grace, was the end of the law. The old law was made to cease after Jesus came, because the law was supposed to lead us to Christ, and Christ is the end of the law. Thus, everything written in the Old was written for our learning. Tithing was given to the Levitical priesthood of Aaron and his male descendants, who were mortal men that died. However, God changed it from the Levitical priesthood of Aaron to the priesthood of Christ, who is eternal and can never die. When God changed the Levitical priesthood of Aaron to the priesthood of Christ, the old priesthood system of tithing was also changed. The Levitical priesthood was moved from the priesthood of Aaron, who was from the tribe of Levi, to Jesus, who is a descendant of the tribe of Judah, even if no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar as a priest. For this reason, the old requirement of priesthood was set aside, discontinued, annulled, because it was weak and useless. And God cancelled the first covenant in order to put the second into effect. Thus, a new system was established with an oath through Jesus Christ, who is made the perfect high priest forever. Jesus Christ is the testator of the New Testament. Therefore, we do not need the testator of the Old Covenant. The first covenant was between God and the Israelites, and it was effective only until a better system could be established by God. When God sent Jesus Christ, He became a better covenant, not only for Israel, but also for all humanity. But now, which is present tense, Jesus, our high priest, has been given a ministry that is far superior to the old priesthood. For he is the one who mediates for us a far better covenant with God based on better promises. When God speaks of a new covenant, it means He has made the first one obsolete, out of use, annulled, out of date, and the old was made to disappear. The old system and His ordinances were completely abolished by Jesus' death on the cross. We are discharged from the obligation of Moses' law. Thus, we don't follow the laws of legalism through Moses, but we follow the laws of righteousness through Jesus Christ. Henceforth, our foundation are to be built of Jesus Christ, who is our apostle, prophet, and chief cornerstone. Now, what are the differences between the old tithing system and the new tithing system? Number 1. In the Old Testament, God required a tenth of Israelites' produce, crops such as seeds, grains, fruits, flocks, oil, and all the produce of the ground. The old system only deals with foods and drinks. This commandment was only specifically given to the children of Israel and not to other nations or the church. In the New Testament, we give money from our earnings and not produce or crops from the ground. Number 2, in the Old Testament tithing, the law decides what the people gave, a tenth of all their fields produce each year. But in the New Testament, we that are the church, we decide in our heart how much we are going to give from our earning, and it is not decided by the law, neither is it decided by the pastor. God gave us and made us to excel in the grace of giving in the New Testament. Number 3, in the Old Testament, the people gave once a year, and also they were commanded to give once every 3 years to the poor who were living in their hometowns. But in the New Testament, the early church collected offerings weekly and not yearly. The offerings were collected on the first day of each week, which is every Sunday. If any church wants to be glued to the Old Testament tithing system, they should tell their congregation to tithe once a year or once every 3 years instead of weekly. Number 4 differences between the Old and the New Testament tithing. In the Old Testament, the people of Israel were compelled to tithe, and men were sent to collect their tithe directly from their field, whether they like it or not. The New Testament, we are not compelled or forced to give, but we are encouraged to give generously, bountifully, and not sparingly. Number 5. In the Old Testament, the people gave under pressure and under compulsion. Many of them were reluctant to give. However, if they refused to tithe or to give their produce or their flocks, they were also given the opportunity to redeem their tithe and pay his value in money, plus additional 20% was charged on top of their value of the produce or the livestock. This is the second place where money is involved in Old Testament tithing, because when they refused to give their flocks and their produce, they had the opportunity to redeem it with money and pay additional 20% value to their tithe. However, in the New Testament, we do not give under pressure or under compulsion. This means don't give if you don't want to give, because no one is forcing it out of you, and no one is going to charge 20% interest on your money for refusing to give. In the New Testament, the church was not greedy. They gave cheerfully, they gave sacrificially, they gave proportionally, or a portion of their income out of what they had, and not out of what they did not have. The church also gave periodically. On the first day of each week, they set something aside to give. No percentage was specified or given to them. They gave anonymously without announcing it to everybody. Number 6. In the Old Testament, they were under a curse for not tithing. However, in the New Testament, after the death of Jesus, Jesus fulfilled and took away all laws that preceded his death. After the death of Jesus, it was then that he cancelled all the curses that was associated to the old law, and took tithing from what we owe God to a seed we sow into God's kingdom. Therefore, whether anyone give or not, no one is under a curse, because every curse that associated with the old law was cancelled by the death of Christ. However, Jesus encourages us and tells us in his word that it is more blessed to give than to receive. For when you give, it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, shall men give into your bosom. With the same measure that you give, it shall be measured to you also. So when it comes to the New Testament or the New Covenant giving, everything is a seed to give. We can give money, we can give love, we can give our time, we can give our talent, we can give encouragement, we can give hospitality, and not just money. Now, let's talk about what the Old Testament and the New Testament giving were meant for. In the Old Testament, tithe and offerings were used to support the Levites and the priests. While in the New Testament, we have no Levite nor priest, but God has made all those who believe on Jesus Christ to be priests to God. Instead of having the old system of Levites and priests as ministers, Jesus now changed it after he resurrected to apostles, prophets, pastors, evangelists, and teachers. In the Old Testament, the Levites were commanded to keep 90% of the tithe, and they were commanded to pay 10%, a tenth of the tithe had received, to the chief priest and to other less privileged people. While in the New Testament, there are not records which stated that the apostles have to pay 10% of the money collected to chief priests, Pharisees, Sadducees, or to the Sanhedrins. Neither was there any place that indicates that 10% was paid to Jewish temple. Sapphires was one of the Jewish high priests who plotted to kill Jesus. However, there was no indication that the disciples paid tithe to these Jewish high priests. In the Old Testament, they brought their tithe to the storerooms or storehouse. A storehouse is not a church. A storehouse is a chamber which was designated to hold all the first fruit, tithe, offering that were collected for the support of the priests and the Levites, and it is not a synagogue or a church. We must not forget that ancient Israelites were farmers, agricultural society, and every one of them had their own storehouses where goods were stored. Even Joseph built a similar storehouse in Egypt before the famine. While in the New Testament, believers sold their properties, their possession, and they brought the money to the church, to the apostles, and they shared the money with those in need, and they did not take it to store at a storehouse. In the Old Testament, tithes were used to meet the needs of the poor, the fatherless, orphans, widows, strangers, foreigners who were deserted from their place due to war and unknown reasons. While in the New Testament, their giving was also used to meet the needs of the poor, the fatherless who are orphans, and the widows in the church. They were very generous to the less privileged, to those who could barely earn ends meet. The tithes and offerings were God's welfare system, which He put in place to care for the people who were genuinely in need and who were the most vulnerable and weak in the society, both in the old and in the new. The church is supposed to be the biggest charitable institution on earth. The reason the early church grew massively was because they implemented these principles of charitable works in their communities, and they reach out to people and care for them. And God added to the church every day. Next time, I will continue in part 3 on how to please God with our giving. I hope this helped. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord guide you.